President Trump continues to forge forth on his anti-free trade program. And this is obviously not good policy. Tucker Carlson made the best case on this last night. There are a bunch of folks who are on the Trump side of the aisle who are trying to make the case for tariffs, who are trying to make the case for protectionism. My problem with tariffs and protectionism, obviously, is that they believe in the power of centralized government. Here's Tucker trying to make his strongest case for technology and trade being the downfall of American civilization. It's not a horrible case, but I don't think it's a convincing one either.
Lawmakers in both parties, for example, have heartily embraced self-driving vehicles and drone delivery of packages. It's all impressive technology, but what would be the effect on employment? Has anyone asked that? There are more than 3 million professional truck drivers in this country. It is the most common job in the majority of American states. More than 90% of drivers are men. Thanks to technology, many of these men are about to lose their jobs. That's a lot of unemployed Americans. That's a lot of broken families. Washington is not worried at all about this. Lawmakers and business leaders assure us that those truck drivers will be just fine. They'll find something else to do, something better, in fact, with higher pay. And maybe they will. But keep in mind, our leaders said the very same thing about manufacturing jobs 30 years ago.
Okay, so this is what Tucker points out here is, I think, a generalized argument that can always be made in favor of centralized government. And what he's saying is there's a group of people in the United States. They are lower educated white men, basically. These are people who are living in the middle of the country and people who are working in non-technology jobs. These are people who are working on lines. These are people who are truck drivers. And these people are going to be hurt by technology and trade, and we have to do something for these people. But the implication is, and throughout this monologue, was that these people, if they're not taken care of, number one, that they are going to not get married, they're not going to stick around for their wives and children, that they are going to start acting in worse ways. There are a couple of assumptions embedded in Tucker's notion here that I think are problematic. So problem number one is he seems to suggest that poverty and lack of job opportunity cause immorality. I don't actually think that's the case. I think that moral people tend to act morally whether they are poor or whether they are rich. There are lots of terrible rich people. There are lots of wonderful poor people. There are lots of people who make a lot of money in their jobs, and there are lots of people who make very little money, and all of them go to the same church. So when Tucker suggests that, people who are earning a lower wage are suddenly going to not stick around for their kids, I'm not sure I see the correlation there, or at least I'm going to resist the correlation. The other thing is that this is not really a case for tariffs. It's not really a case for shutting down trade or shutting down technology. So I'm not sure what Tucker is actually arguing for here. I agree that a lot of this stuff is a problem. I agree that we have a problem with people who are not lawyers or doctors, people who don't have higher education degrees. And what do we do with them as the technology develops and they lose their jobs? What do we do with those folks? But the answer is not to stifle the technology. Tucker seems to be making the case against self-driving trucks. Okay, but you could have made that exact same case against cars back in 1910. You could have said there are a bunch of wheelwrights who are going to lose their jobs. This is true with every technological change, every single one. There are a bunch of people who lost their jobs over at AT&T when people stopped using landlines. There are a bunch of folks who lost their jobs when dial-up internet went away. There are a bunch of people who lose their jobs when any new technology is developed. There are a bunch of people who lose their jobs. The question is, are a consummate number of jobs created on the other end? Are there more jobs that are created on the other end, or just as many jobs created? And, by the way, that isn't even really the question. The question is, does quality of life go up for the vast majority of Americans every time there's a technological change? Because the goal of an economy is not to create jobs. The goal of jobs is to create an economy, meaning the purpose of a job is to create a product or service someone else wants to buy. It is not the job of the economy per se or the government per se to ensure that anyone has a job. If you get that polarity backwards, you end up at communism where everybody has a job, but they're not producing anything anybody wants. Centralized government is not the answer here. Now, there was a piece that I referenced a little bit yesterday. I want to go through in a little more detail here regarding tariffs. There's a piece over at the Journal of American Greatness. The Journal of American Greatness was an outlet devoted to President Trump's purported philosophy. And it's kind of lost some of its luster because President Trump doesn't have really a coherent philosophy. But there's a piece there that was taking on something I said on the show about free trade. And this piece is by a guy named Spencer Morrison, who's a law student and editor-in-chief of the National Economics Editorial, which I've never heard of. And here's what he says. He says, the piece is titled, Why Ben Shapiro is Wrong on Free Trade. Now, let's just make something clear. My perspective on free trade is backed by essentially 100% of economists. There are very few economists who believe in tariffs. When I say very few, I mean that if you polled actual economists, the number of economists who would dismiss free trade in favor of tariffs, that number is very close to zero. So here is what this article says. I think it's worth discussing in detail. So Morrison argues in favor of tariffs, and he begins with an analysis of a 3-minute segment of video from this podcast in which I talked about the flaws in tariff-based economics. I specifically talked in that segment about the fact that trade deficits don't matter, about the fact that if you have a trade deficit with your grocery store is not screwing you, nor are you being screwed by your grocery store. And if we buy more product from China than China buys from us, that does not mean that we are losing to China. China just has a bunch of dollars it has to spend, which it then has to invest back in American bonds or back in American businesses or in American real estate. Now, obviously, I've done a lot of work on tariffs on the show, but there's a new argument that Morrison presents that I think that you should know about just so that you know what you're talking about when you talk about free trade. So first, Morrison sort of misrepresents my argument. He suggests that I think trade deficits are an active good. I've never said trade deficits are an active good. They're not an active good. They're not an active bad. They're just a thing, right? You sometimes have a trade deficit with your grocery store. Sometimes you're a contractor to your grocery store and you have a trade surplus. None of that means that anything inherently bad or good is going on. As I've quoted before, Thomas Sowell says this: in general, international deficits and surpluses have had virtually no correlation with the performance of most nations' economies. Germany and France have had international trade surpluses while their unemployment rates were in double digits. Japan's post-war rise to economic prominence on the world stage included years when it ran deficits as well as years when it ran surpluses. The U.S. was the biggest debtor nation in the world during its rise to industrial supremacy, became a creditor as a result of lending money to its European allies during the First World War, and has been both a debtor and a creditor at various times since. Through it all, the American standard of living has remained the highest in the world, unaffected by whether it was a creditor or a debtor nation. Now, Morrison, this author, claims that I have called Trump a flip-flopper on free trade, which I never have. He's been very clear that he's anti-free trade. But here's the central argument that's made. And this is the one that I think we should spend some time talking about, just so that you know the arguments that are being made against free trade and why they are wrong. So here's what Morrison says. He talks about comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is this idea. Let's say that I, Ben Shapiro, I am great at making this podcast, but I also happen to be very good at growing oranges. And I'm pretty good at it. Not like the best, but pretty good, right? And let's see that I can even grow oranges better than my local grocery store. But I'm the very best at making this podcast. So every minute that I spend not growing oranges is a minute that I spend on the podcast, and every minute that I spend on the podcast is a minute I spend not growing oranges. Should I spend my time doing the podcast, or should I spend my time growing oranges? The answer, of course, is that I should take all the money I'm earning from the podcast and go buy some oranges at a cheaper price. That the time value, right, the monetary value of my time is higher doing the thing that I am best at, even if it means that I'm buying from somebody else who's specializing in an area where I'm still the best, but it's just not the best thing I do. I'm better at the podcast than I am at growing oranges, therefore I should spend more of my time doing the podcast than growing oranges, even if the second best guy at growing oranges is not as good as I am at it, right? He should specialize in growing oranges, I should specialize in podcasting, and then we should trade services for one another. I should give him a subscription for $9.99 a month, and he should give me a bag of oranges, right? This is the idea of comparative advantage. So here's what Morrison says. He says, comparative advantage is an elegant theory, but too often is domain specific. It only works when certain preconditions are met. For example, capital must be immobile for the theory to apply. Okay, meaning that I can't just take my capital and go buy an orange farm in Brazil. Now, Shapiro ignores this crucial limiting factor and applies comparative advantage to just about everything. This is his root error. For example, comparative advantage suggests the key to getting rich is to specialize production regardless of what you produce. That is, a country with comparative advantage in growing soybeans should focus on growing more soybeans, while a country with comparative advantage in manufacturing semiconductors should focus on manufacturing more semiconductors. In either case, this supposes their relative wealth will correlate with the degree of specialization as opposed to the complexity of their production. This is objectively wrong. So what he says is that if you're a country that produces semiconductors, you're going to be richer than a country that produces soybeans. There are a bunch of problems with this. So, first of all, it is important to note that countries don't just make soybeans or semiconductors, right? They make lots of products. Countries are not individuals. Countries are broad amalgams of individuals, all of whom are in different industries, right? So this guy says, well, this guy makes the obvious point that if you grow bananas, you're going to make less money than if you make computers. This is obviously true. Okay, but of course, countries that develop higher profit sectors are going to have higher growth rates. And of course, the decisions that you make now are going to have impact on the future development of industry. So this is his second argument. He says, okay, so granted that a country that grows bananas makes less money than a country that makes semiconductors. So if you are a banana growing country, comparative advantage would suggest you keep growing bananas. But that means that you're never going to become a semiconductor making country. Therefore, what you should really do is you should tariff semiconductors. You should put a tariff on foreign semiconductors. And then you should grow your business in semiconductors from the inside. Okay, this neglects a few points. First of all, you cannot tell which sectors of an economy are likely to be the most profitable. Right? This is something called, what he's talking about here is a term called path dependency. Path dependency is You made a mistake. You decided to grow bananas, and now you're stuck growing bananas forever, even if it would be more profitable for you to move into making semiconductors. But this assumes that you can't just stop making bananas and start making semiconductors. It assumes there's no bank that will lend you money if you get a computer education degree to go make semiconductors. Right? This assumes there's no mobility in the economy, which of course is not true. And if the government were to say, listen, we're going to tariff semiconductors, we're going to tax all the banana growers and take all their money, and we're going to use it to subsidize semiconductors, who's to say the government knows which industry is going to grow fastest? When government introduces subsidies into an industry, it usually makes that industry more profitable, but it doesn't end up picking the industry that all